In the early 14th century, long before the age of modern medicine, the world was deeply connected through trade, migration, and conquest, yet people had little understanding of how disease spread. It was in this environment that one of the deadliest pandemics in human history began its journey. The catastrophe, later known as the Black Death, is widely believed to have originated in Central Asia, in regions where vast grasslands supported large populations of rodents. Among these animals lived fleas that carried a deadly bacterium called Yersinia pestis. Under normal circumstances, the disease circulated quietly among wild rodent populations, but changes in climate, human activity, and expanding trade networks brought infected animals and fleas into closer contact with people. What had once been a localized natural disease reservoir slowly turned into the spark for a global disaster. The Mongol Empire, which in the 13th and 14th centuries stretched across much of Asia, played an indirect but crucial role in the spread of the plague. By creating relative stability across enormous territories, the Mongols enabled trade along the Silk Road to flourish. Caravans moved regularly between China, Central Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, carrying silk, spices, precious metals, and countless other goods. Along with these products traveled rats hidden in supplies, wagons, and ships, and on these rats rode fleas carrying the plague bacterium. The trade routes that brought wealth and cultural exchange also became highways for infection. Cities that had grown prosperous and densely populated due to commerce were especially vulnerable, as they provided ideal environments for rats and close human contact. One of the key early points in the westward spread of the plague was the trading city of Kaffa, located on the Crimean Peninsula along the Black Sea. Kaffa was a Genoese-controlled port and a bustling hub linking Europe and Asia. In the 1340s, it came under siege by Mongol forces. Historical accounts describe a horrifying episode in which besieging armies, themselves afflicted by plague, reportedly hurled infected corpses over the city walls. Whether this specific tactic was as widespread as later stories suggest, there is little doubt that the disease entered the city during the siege. From Kaffa, Genoese merchants fled by ship, attempting to escape the conflict and the sickness. Unknowingly, they carried infected rats and fleas with them across the Black Sea and into the Mediterranean. Their escape would help ignite a chain reaction of outbreaks. When the ships arrived at ports such as Messina and Sicily in 1347, the results were terrifying. Sailors were already sick or dying, their bodies covered in dark swellings, feverish and delirious. Local people, having never seen such symptoms on this scale, were confused and frightened. Authorities often tried to turn the ships away, but it was too late. Rats disembarked along with cargo, and fleas soon found new hosts among the urban rodent populations. From Sicily, the plague spread rapidly to other major ports: Genoa, Venice, Marseille, and Barcelona. Coastal cities served as gateways to the interior of Europe. Traders, pilgrims, soldiers, and refugees carried the infection along roads and rivers, ensuring that even remote villages would eventually feel its impact. At this time, medical knowledge in Europe was based largely on ancient theories, especially the idea of the four humors and the belief that illness was caused by imbalances in the body or by miasma, or bad air. People did not know about bacteria, viruses, or the role of fleas and rats. As a result, early responses to the plague were ineffective and sometimes harmful. Physicians recommended treatments such as bloodletting, herbal mixtures, or burning aromatic substances to cleanse the air. Others believed the disease was a punishment from God, sent to chastise humanity for its sins. Religious processions, prayers, and acts of penance became common, sometimes bringing large groups of people together in close contact, which only helped the disease spread further. The social and economic conditions of 14th century Europe also made the continent especially vulnerable. Many cities were overcrowded, with narrow streets, poor sanitation, and limited access to clean water. Waste often accumulated in public areas, attracting rats. Houses were small and packed with large families, making it easy for infections to move from person to person. Malnutrition was common in the years before the plague due to crop failures and harsh weather, which weakened immune systems. When the disease arrived, populations already struggling with hardship had little resistance. The speed at which the plague advanced stunned observers. Entire communities could be devastated in a matter of weeks. The origins of the Black Death also involve environmental factors that historians and scientists continue to study. Climate changes in the centuries before the outbreak may have influenced rodent populations in Asia, causing them to migrate or bringing them into new contact with human settlements. Periods of drought or shifts in temperature can disrupt natural ecosystems, pushing disease-carrying animals closer to trade routes and cities. Such environmental pressures, combined with human expansion and mobility, created the perfect conditions for a local disease to become a pandemic. The Black Death was not simply an accident of history. It was the result of complex interactions between nature and human society. As the plague moved from region to region, it did not travel in a straight line but in waves, sometimes flaring up intensely in one place, while temporarily sparing another. News traveled more slowly than the disease. So many communities had little warning. Rumors and stories preceded the arrival of the plague, often exaggerated but still terrifying. People heard of towns where most residents had died, of mass graves, and of mysterious symptoms that struck without mercy. Yet daily life continued until the first cases appeared locally. Markets opened, ships docked, and travelers arrived, each new contact carrying the possibility of infection. By the time people realized the danger, it was often too late to prevent widespread transmission. The origins of the Black Death thus lie at the intersection of global trade, military conflict, environmental change, and limited medical knowledge. A bacterium that had long existed in animal populations found the opportunity to move across continents through human networks, the very systems that connected the medieval world. Commerce, exploration, and empire became channels for catastrophe. Once established in Europe, the plague would not remain confined there. It also spread into North Africa and the Middle East, following similar patterns along trade and pilgrimage routes. The pandemic became a truly interconnected disaster, affecting diverse cultures and societies. Understanding these origins helps explain why the Black Death was so devastating. It was not just a disease, it was a product of its time, shaped by the ways people lived, worked, and moved. The lack of scientific understanding meant that early containment measures were rare and often misguided. Quarantine, which would later become an important tool in fighting epidemics, was only beginning to be practiced in some port cities, and even then, inconsistently. By the time more effective responses developed, the plague had already established itself deeply within human populations. In hindsight, the story of the Black Death's beginnings reveals how vulnerable human societies can be when new diseases emerge in a connected world. What started in distant rodent colonies in Central Asia traveled thousands of miles through invisible chains of transmission. Ships laden with goods also carried death. Roads that linked cultures also linked outbreaks. The origins of the pandemic show that human progress, trade, urban growth, and political expansion can have unintended and deadly consequences when combined with natural forces beyond immediate control. The Black Death's journey from remote landscapes to the heart of Europe stands as a powerful example of how a microscopic organism, given the right conditions, can reshape the course of history. Once the disease that would become known as the Black Death reached major population centers, the way it spread turned a deadly outbreak into an unstoppable catastrophe. The illness was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, but the people of the 14th century had no concept of microbes or transmission through insects. What they witnessed instead were sudden fevers, agonizing swellings, and death that often came within days. Behind the scenes, a complex chain of infection was at work, involving rodents, fleas, human movement, and environmental conditions that allowed the plague to move with terrifying speed across continents. The most common form of the disease during the pandemic was bubonic plague. It typically began when an infected flea bit a human. Fleas often fed on the blood of black rats, which thrived in medieval towns and on ships. When large numbers of rats died from the infection, their fleas sought new hosts, including people. After a bite, the bacteria entered the bloodstream and traveled to the lymph nodes. There, they multiplied rapidly, causing the nodes to swell into painful lumps called buboes, usually in the groin, armpits, or neck. Victims developed high fevers, chills, weakness, and intense pain. The swellings sometimes turned dark due to bleeding under the skin, contributing to the term Black Death. Without treatment, which did not exist at the time, many patients died within a week. Another deadly form was pneumonic plague, which affected the lungs. This version could develop from untreated bubonic plague or spread directly from person to person through respiratory droplets. Victims suffered coughing, chest pain, difficulty breathing, and often coughed up blood. Pneumonic plague was especially terrifying because it did not require fleas or rats. Close contact between people was enough to transmit it. In crowded homes, hospitals, monasteries, or ships, entire groups could become infected in a short time. This form of the disease had an extremely high fatality rate and could kill in just a few days, sometimes even hours after severe symptoms appeared. The third form, septicemic plague, occurred when the bacteria multiplied in the bloodstream. This could happen as a complication of bubonic or pneumonic plague, or directly through infection. Victims often experienced bleeding under the skin, turning their extremities dark or black, along with shock and organ failure. Death could come so quickly that some people died before the classic buboes even formed. To medieval observers, this made the disease seem even more mysterious and unpredictable. One day a person could appear healthy, the next, they might be dead. The structure of medieval society played a major role in how quickly the plague spread. Cities were densely packed, with narrow streets and closely built houses. Waste disposal systems were primitive, and garbage, animal remains, and human waste often accumulated near living areas. Such conditions created ideal habitats for rats. Grain stores, markets, and ships were especially attractive to rodents, which moved easily between buildings and neighborhoods. As rats traveled, so did the fleas that carried the disease. People shared beds, tools, clothing, and food, providing additional opportunities for infection. Especially once pneumonic plague became involved, trade networks acted like arteries carrying the disease far beyond its initial points of arrival. Merchants traveled regularly between cities, stopping at inns and marketplaces. Pilgrims journeyed to religious sites, sometimes in large groups. Soldiers marched across regions during ongoing conflicts. Refugees fled areas already struck by the plague, hoping to escape, but sometimes bringing the infection with them. Rivers served as transportation routes, linking inland towns to coastal ports. Every movement of people or goods created new chances for the bacterium to find fresh hosts. Because the incubation period could last several days, individuals often traveled while already infected, but not yet visibly ill. Seasonal patterns also influenced transmission. Warmer months tended to see more flea activity, which could increase the spread of bubonic plague. However, pneumonic plague could flourish even in colder weather due to indoor crowding. Outbreaks sometimes surged in waves, flaring up, declining, and then returning. Some areas were struck multiple times over the years. The disease did not move evenly. Some villages were nearly wiped out, while others experienced lower mortality, possibly due to chance, partial immunity, or differences in local conditions. This uneven impact made the plague seem random and even more frightening. Medical practices of the time did little to slow the spread. Physicians often moved from house to house treating patients, unintentionally exposing themselves and others. Hospitals, where they existed, could become centers of infection due to the concentration of sick individuals. Caregivers, family members, clergy, and nurses faced especially high risks because of close contact with the ill. Protective measures were based on incorrect theories. Some doctors wore masks with long beaks filled with herbs, believing they were filtering poisoned air. While the costumes later became symbolic, they did not stop the real agents of transmission, fleas and respiratory droplets. Fear and misunderstanding also shaped how communities responded, sometimes worsening the situation. People gathered in churches to pray for deliverance, bringing crowds together in enclosed spaces. Processions of penitents traveled from town to town, hoping to atone for sins, but in doing so may have helped carry the disease farther. In some cases, authorities tried to block travelers or isolate the sick, but these measures were inconsistent and often too late. The concept of quarantine, keeping ships or people isolated for a set period, began to develop during this time, especially in Italian port cities, but it was not yet widely or systematically applied. The plague spread was not limited to Europe. Similar patterns unfolded in the Middle East and North Africa. Trade across the Mediterranean and along caravan routes carried the disease to cities such as Cairo, Damascus, and Constantinople. Pilgrimage routes to holy sites also contributed to movement. Just as in Europe, crowded urban conditions and limited medical understanding allowed the infection to take hold. The pandemic demonstrated how interconnected Afro-Eurasian societies had become by the 14th century, even without modern transportation. Animals other than rats may also have played roles in local transmission, and the exact balance between flea-borne and person-to-person spread likely varied by region and time. Modern research suggests that multiple pathways of infection may have operated simultaneously. What is clear is that once established in human populations, the disease was extremely difficult to stop with the knowledge and tools available at the time. The speed of travel in the medieval world was slow compared to today, yet the plague still crossed vast distances in just a few years, a testament to the power of repeated, short-range transmission along dense networks of human contact. The psychological impact of this rapid spread was immense. People watched neighbors fall ill one after another, sometimes within the same household. Stories circulated of towns where most residents had died, of carts piled with bodies, of priests overwhelmed by the number of last rites they were asked to perform. The sense that the disease was everywhere and could strike anyone at any time created panic. Some people fled cities, inadvertently spreading infection to rural areas. Others stayed, resigned to fate. The invisible nature of the cause made the plague seem like an unstoppable force, moving with a will of its own. In modern terms, the Black Death illustrates how infectious diseases can exploit social networks, mobility, and environmental conditions. The bacterium did not need advanced transportation. It relied on ordinary human activities, trading, traveling, living closely together. The spread of the plague was a chain reaction, each link connecting to the next through daily life. Because people did not understand the true mechanisms, they could not effectively break the chain. By the time the worst waves of the pandemic subsided, tens of millions were dead, and entire regions had been transformed. The story of how the disease spread is not just about biology but about society. It shows how health is tied to living conditions, knowledge, and collective behavior. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, and constant movement created opportunities for transmission. Misguided beliefs shaped responses that sometimes increased risk. Yet out of this tragedy would eventually come new ideas about quarantine, public health, and the importance of controlling the movement of potentially infected people and goods. The horror of the Black Death forced societies to confront the reality that disease could move along the same pathways as prosperity, and that understanding and managing those pathways was essential for survival. As the plague tightened its grip on towns and cities, daily life began to unravel in ways that few could have imagined. What had once been busy streets filled with merchants, craftsmen, children, and animals slowly turned silent except for the sound of bells tolling for the dead. The disease did not just attack the body, it tore apart the routines, relationships, and sense of security that held medieval society together. Every sunrise brought uncertainty, and every cough or fever sparked fear. People lived with the constant awareness that death might be only days or even hours away. Households were among the first places where the crisis became visible. In tightly packed homes, when one family member fell ill, others often followed quickly. There was little possibility of true isolation. Beds were shared, rooms were small, and ventilation was poor. Families faced painful choices whether to stay and care for the sick, risking their own lives, or to flee in the hope of survival. Some chose to nurse their loved ones despite the danger, while others, overwhelmed by fear, abandoned even close relatives. Stories circulated of parents leaving children, spouses deserting one another, and neighbors refusing to help. Whether all such accounts were common or sometimes exaggerated by chroniclers, they reflected the emotional shock and moral strain the plague created. The presence of death became a constant feature of the environment. In the early stages of outbreaks, the dead might still receive traditional burials, with clergy present and family members in attendance. But as numbers grew, these customs broke down. Graveyards filled rapidly, and new burial pits were dug outside city walls. Carts moved through streets collecting bodies, sometimes with little ceremony. In some places, mass graves were used, with layers of corpses covered quickly to make room for more. The familiar rituals that had given meaning to death were replaced by hurried, impersonal processes. This added to the sense of horror and loss, as people felt that even in death, dignity was being stripped away. Work and commerce suffered greatly. Markets that had once bustled with activity became half empty or closed entirely. Farmers feared traveling to towns, and townspeople feared contact with outsiders. Fields went untilled as laborers died or fled. Workshops shut down because masters, apprentices, or customers were gone. Essential services struggled to continue. Bakers, millers, and water carriers were desperately needed, yet those who remained faced enormous risk. Prices for food and goods could rise sharply due to shortages, adding economic stress to the fear of illness. At the same time, some individuals exploited the chaos, hoarding supplies or charging high fees for services, which could create resentment within communities. Medical care, limited as it was, became overwhelmed. Physicians and surgeons were in short supply, and many fell ill themselves. The IR understanding of the disease was based on ancient ideas about bodily humors and poisoned air. Treatments included bloodletting, herbal poultices, or attempts to balance hot and cold qualities in the body. Some advised patients to avoid baths, believing water might open pores to infection, while others recommended carrying flowers or spices to ward off bad air. Though most of these remedies were ineffective, the effort to treat the sick provided some sense of action in a situation that otherwise felt uncontrollable. Religious life intensified in response to the crisis. Churches filled with people praying for mercy and protection. Special services, fasts, and processions were organized. Many believed the plague was a punishment sent by God, a sign of divine anger at human sin. This belief led some to examine their lives more closely, confessing, giving charity, or trying to reform their behavior. Others joined movements of extreme penance. Groups of flagellants traveled from town to town, publicly whipping themselves to atone for sins they believed had brought the plague. While these acts reflected deep faith and fear, large gatherings also increased the chance of spreading pneumonic plague. At the same time, faith could be shaken. As prayers seemed unanswered and clergy died alongside ordinary people, some questioned long-held beliefs. If God was just, why were the innocent suffering? Why were entire families wiped out? These doubts did not necessarily lead to a loss of religion, but they did create spiritual confusion and anxiety. Some people turned to superstition, amulets, or charms, hoping for protection. Astrologers claimed the plague was caused by unusual alignments of planets. Others blamed poisoned wells or secret enemies. In the absence of scientific understanding, rumors and fear filled the gaps. Social bonds were tested in extreme ways. In some communities, mutual aid and solidarity emerged. Neighbors shared food, cared for orphans, and helped bury the dead. In others, suspicion and avoidance dominated. Houses with sick residents might be marked or shunned. Strangers were viewed with fear. Travel restrictions sometimes trapped people far from home. Inns and hostels became risky places, as guests did not know who might be infected. The normal trust that allowed society to function was eroded, replaced by caution and, at times, hostility. The psychological toll of constant loss was enormous. Grief became a daily experience, yet there was often little time or space to process it. People could lose multiple family members within weeks. The sight and smell of death became familiar. Chroniclers of the time wrote of despair, numbness, and a sense that the end of the world might be near. Some individuals responded with reckless behavior, believing that if death was inevitable, moral rules no longer mattered. Feasting, drinking, or indulgence in pleasures were seen by some as ways to escape fear, even temporarily. Others withdrew into isolation, avoiding contact as much as possible. Children experienced the plague in their own painful ways. Many were orphaned and left without support. Some were taken in by relatives or charitable institutions, while others wandered or struggled to survive. Education and apprenticeship systems were disrupted, affecting the next generation's future. The loss of so many adults meant that knowledge, skills, and traditions were sometimes broken or delayed in being passed on. Entire lines of family memory could disappear in a single outbreak. Communication about the plague relied on word of mouth, letters, and official notices. News traveled slowly, often mixed with exaggeration. A town might hear that another city had lost half its population, creating panic before the disease even arrived. Attempts by authorities to control movement or impose rules were difficult to enforce. In some places, city gates were closed or travelers were inspected, but economic needs and human desperation made strict control nearly impossible. Life continued in a strange balance between normal activities and ever-present fear. Art and culture also reflected the changed atmosphere. Themes of death, judgment, and the fragility of life became more common. Images of skeletons, graves, and the dance of death, where people of all social ranks were shown led by death itself, reminded viewers that no one was immune. These artistic expressions were not only about fear, but also about confronting reality and finding meaning in suffering. They show how deeply the plague penetrated not just bodies but imaginations. Living through the plague meant adapting constantly. People learned to recognize symptoms, to be cautious about contact, to respond to new waves of illness. Yet the unpredictability remained. A family might survive one outbreak only to be struck in the next. Hope and despair alternated as cases rose and fell. The experience of daily life during the Black Death was therefore one of profound instability. Familiar structures, family, work, religion, community, were all shaken, sometimes breaking, sometimes bending, but surviving. In this environment, survival required not only physical resilience but emotional strength. Those who lived through the worst years carried memories that would shape their outlooks for the rest of their lives. The routines of ordinary days, buying bread, visiting neighbors, attending services, had been transformed into acts shadowed by risk. The plague forced people to confront mortality in a direct and relentless way. It revealed both the fragility of social order and the capacity of humans to endure, help one another, and search for meaning, even in the darkest times. The scale of death brought by the Black Death was unlike anything Europe had experienced before, and its consequences went far beyond the immediate tragedy. As the plague swept across regions, entire communities were transformed. It is estimated that between 1/4 and 1/2 of Europe's population died within a few years, amounting to tens of millions of people. In some towns, the loss was so severe that streets stood empty and houses fell into ruin. Villages disappeared from records entirely, their fields reclaimed by nature. The sudden reduction in population reshaped social structures, economic systems, and power relationships in ways that would influence history for centuries. One of the most immediate effects was a severe shortage of labor. Before the plague, much of European society was organized under the feudal system, where peasants worked the land owned by nobles in exchange for protection and the right to farm small plots for themselves. Labor had been abundant, and peasants often had little bargaining power. After the plague, the situation changed dramatically. With so many workers dead, landowners struggled to maintain their estates. Fields went untilled, harvests declined, and incomes dropped. Surviving workers suddenly found their labor in high demand. Peasants and laborers began to demand higher wages, better working conditions, and more freedom. Some left their former lords to seek opportunities elsewhere, moving to towns or other regions where pay was better. This mobility challenged traditional ties that had bound people to specific lands for generations. Authorities in several countries tried to resist these changes. Laws were passed to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, or to prevent workers from leaving their employers. In England, for example, the Statute of Labourers attempted to control wages and movement. However, enforcement was difficult, and the economic reality of scarcity often overpowered legal restrictions. The weakening of feudal structures was gradual but significant. As peasants gained leverage, some were able to negotiate rents instead of unpaid labor services. Over time, this shift contributed to the decline of serfdom in many regions. While not all areas experienced the same pace of change, the balance of power between landowners and workers was altered. A society that had once seemed rigid began to show signs of flexibility and transformation, driven largely by demographic shock. Urban life also changed. Cities that had lost large portions of their populations faced empty homes, abandoned workshops, and reduced trade. Yet for survivors, new opportunities emerged. Property that had once been expensive became more accessible. Some individuals inherited land or wealth from deceased relatives, improving their economic position. Guilds and trades that had been tightly controlled sometimes opened to new members to replace those lost. This period saw the rise of new social mobility for certain groups, though poverty and inequality still remained realities for many. The psychological and cultural impact of such widespread death cannot be overstated. Constant exposure to mortality changed how people thought about life, religion, and the future. Traditional confidence in institutions, including the church, was shaken. Many clergy had died caring for the sick, and replacements were sometimes less trained or experienced. While faith remained central to most people's lives, there was also disillusionment and questioning. This shift in attitudes is often linked by historians to later movements of reform and intellectual change in Europe. At the same time, fear and grief sometimes turn into anger and violence. In their search for explanations, people often looked for scapegoats. Jewish communities in particular suffered terrible persecution. False rumors spread that Jews had poisoned wells or deliberately caused the plague. Despite the lack of evidence, these accusations led to attacks, expulsions, and massacres in various towns and cities. Authorities sometimes tried to protect Jewish residents, but often they failed or even supported the violence. These tragic events revealed how fear could override reason and compassion, leading to further suffering alongside the disease itself. Economic patterns shifted in other ways as well. With fewer people to feed, demand for food changed. Some marginal lands that had been farmed before the plague were abandoned, allowing forests and pastures to expand. Livestock farming sometimes became more common than labor-intensive grain production. Diets improved slightly for some survivors, as meat and other goods became more available per person. These changes in land use and consumption patterns had long-term environmental and economic effects. Governments and local authorities also began to think differently about public health and regulation. While medieval understanding of disease was limited, the experience of the plague showed the need for organized responses. Some cities developed early systems of quarantine, isolating ships or travelers for a set period before allowing entry. Health boards or officials were appointed to monitor outbreaks and enforce rules. These measures were not always effective by modern standards, but they marked important steps toward structured public health policies. Family structures were deeply affected. With high mortality, many children were orphaned, and many adults lost spouses. Remarriage was common, sometimes quickly, as people sought companionship and economic stability. Inheritance patterns changed as well. Land and property passed to new hands, sometimes concentrating wealth, sometimes spreading it. Women in some regions found new roles or responsibilities, managing property or businesses after the deaths of male relatives. Though medieval society remained largely patriarchal, the demographic crisis opened spaces for change in certain circumstances. Education and cultural life also felt the impact. Universities, monasteries, and schools lost teachers and students. The transmission of knowledge was disrupted. Yet in the long term, the social changes following the plague contributed to new intellectual currents. Some historians link the demographic and economic shifts after the Black Death to conditions that later supported the Renaissance, with its focus on human experience, art, and inquiry. While the connection is complex, it is clear that the plague helped reshape the context in which European culture developed. Not all consequences were immediately positive or progressive. Many regions experienced economic instability and social unrest. Tensions between classes sometimes erupted into revolts, such as the Peasants' Revolt in England later in the 14th century. These uprisings were driven by a mix of economic demands, resentment of restrictions, and broader dissatisfaction. The plague had upset the old order, but building a new balance took time and often involved conflict. The memory of the Black Death lingered long after the worst. Outbreaks passed. Communities carried stories of mass graves, deserted streets, and miraculous survivals. Annual remembrances, religious foundations, and charitable institutions were sometimes established in response to the trauma. Art, literature, and folklore preserved images of the plague years, shaping how later generations understood the event. The demographic loss was so large that populations in some areas took more than a century to recover to pre-plague levels. In some, the death toll of the Black Death was not just a number, but a force that reshaped society. By removing such a large portion of the population, the plague altered labor systems, economic relationships, and social hierarchies. It weakened some old structures, created opportunities for change, and exposed deep fears and prejudices. The disaster revealed both the vulnerability and adaptability of human communities. Out of immense loss came transformation, painful, uneven, and complex, but powerful enough to redirect the course of history. When the worst waves of the Black Death began to fade, the world that remained was deeply changed. Survivors did not simply return to their old ways of life, because the scale of loss had altered how people thought about health, society, faith, and the future. The memory of the plague lingered in every town that had lost families, in every field that had gone untended, and in every story told about those terrible years. Over time, these experiences shaped new attitudes and practices that would influence medicine, public health, culture, and human understanding of disease. One of the most important long-term outcomes was the gradual development of public health measure. During the initial outbreaks, responses had been confused and inconsistent. But as cities faced repeated waves of plague in later centuries, they began to organize more structured defenses. Italian port cities were among the first to formalize quarantine practices. Ships arriving from infected areas were required to wait for a period, often 40 days, from which the word quarantine originates, before passengers and goods could disembark. The idea was based on observation rather than scientific knowledge, yet it showed a growing awareness that controlling movement could limit the spread of disease. Over time, health boards were established to monitor illness, enforce isolation, and supervise sanitation. Urban sanitation slowly improved as well. Although medieval people did not know about bacteria, they had learned from experience that filth and crowding were associated with sickness. Cities made efforts to regulate waste disposal, clear streets, and manage water sources more carefully. These measures were uneven and often limited by resources and technology, but they represented early steps toward the concept that governments had a responsibility to protect public health. The shock of the Black Death had revealed that disease was not only a personal tragedy, but a collective threat requiring organized action. Medical understanding evolved gradually. Physicians and scholars recorded symptoms, patterns, and outcomes in more detail than before. While many theories remained rooted in older ideas about humors and miasma, observation and record-keeping became more systematic. Over the centuries, this accumulation of knowledge contributed to the eventual development of more scientific approaches to disease. The plague did not immediately lead to modern medicine, but it played a role in pushing societies to take illness more seriously as a subject of study rather than solely as a spiritual or mystical event. The cultural and psychological legacy of the Black Death was equally profound. Art, literature, and religious thought were deeply marked by the experience of mass mortality. Images of death became more common and more realistic. The dance of death motif, showing skeletons leading people of all ranks to the grave, reflected the idea that death was universal and unavoidable. Writers described the fragility of life and the suddenness with which fortune could change. This awareness encouraged both a sense of humility and, at times, a desire to enjoy life while it lasted. The tension between fear of death and appreciation of life became a lasting theme in European culture. Religion remained central, but the relationship between people and religious institutions shifted. The failure of prayers to stop the plague and the loss of many clergy created doubts and criticism. Some individuals sought more personal forms of faith, focusing on individual devotion rather than relying solely on institutional authority. These changes did not happen overnight, but they contributed to long-term movements of reform and questioning within Christianity. The plague experience had shown that suffering could strike the devout and the sinful alike, challenging simple explanations about divine punishment. The memory of the Black Death also influenced how later generations responded to new outbreaks. When plague returned in subsequent centuries, communities often reacted more quickly with isolation and regulation. The concept of tracking disease, restricting travel, and creating health regulations became more accepted. Though these measures were not always successful, they marked a shift toward collective responsibility in managing epidemics. Lessons learned through tragedy gradually became part of shared knowledge. Economically, the changes that followed the plague helped reshape Europe's development. Labor shortages and social mobility contributed to shifts in wealth and opportunity. Over time, these transformations supported the growth of towns, trade, and new forms of enterprise. While the connection is indirect, the social adjustments after the Black Death are often seen as part of the broader transition from medieval to early modern society. The disaster had disrupted old patterns and opened space for change, even if that change came slowly and unevenly. The Black Death also left a legacy in how humans understand their relationship with nature. The pandemic showed that forces beyond human control could overturn entire societies. It highlighted the importance of environment, animals, and unseen agents in shaping human fate. Though people at the time did not know about microbes, later scientific discoveries would reveal how accurate some early observations had been about contagion and living conditions. In this sense, the plague became part of a longer story about humanity learning to recognize and respond to biological threats. Memory itself became a form of legacy. Stories of the plague were passed down through generations, shaping collective identity. In some places, annual commemorations or religious foundations were established in remembrance of those who died. Grave sites, chapels, and artworks served as reminders of the past. These acts of memory were not only about mourning, but also about warning. They carried the message that such disasters could happen again, and that vigilance and care were necessary. The Black Death also influenced ethical and philosophical thought. The scale of suffering raised questions about justice, fate, and human responsibility. Some thinkers emphasized compassion and charity, inspired by those who had risked their lives to help others. The contrast between selfish behavior and selfless acts during the plague years became part of moral reflection. The pandemic revealed both the worst and best aspects of human behavior, leaving a complex legacy of caution and hope. In modern times, historians and scientists continue to study the Black Death to better understand pandemics. Genetic research has identified traces of Yersinia pestis in ancient remains, confirming historical accounts. Studies of trade routes, climate patterns, and social structures help explain how the disease spread so widely. These investigations show that the Black Death is not only a story of the past, but also a source of insight for the present. Modern outbreaks of disease still follow patterns shaped by movement, environment, and social conditions, much like in the 14th century. Ultimately, the legacy of the Black Death is one of transformation born from tragedy. It forced societies to confront mortality on an unprecedented scale, to adapt their economies and institutions, and to rethink beliefs about health and fate. It encouraged the development of public health measures, influenced cultural expression, and contributed to long-term social change. Though the suffering was immense, the lessons learned helped shape more organized responses to disease and a deeper awareness of the connections between people, environment, and health. The memory of the pandemic stands as a reminder of human vulnerability, but also of resilience. Communities rebuilt, populations slowly recovered, and new generations grew up in a world marked by loss, but also by adaptation. The Black Death did not end civilization, it reshaped it. Its legacy lives on in the structures of public health, in cultural memory, and in the continuing effort to understand and control the diseases that challenge humanity. If you enjoy powerful true stories like this, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more untold history and reach our goal faster.